The salmon was getting cold on my plate when my mother-in-law leaned across the dining table and announced, loud enough for every single guest to hear, that my lake house would make the perfect starter home for her son's mistress and their new baby. I should back up. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I'm 31 years old. I'm a partner at a corporate litigation firm in San Francisco, and 3 years ago, I bought a 4,200 square foot timber frame house on the eastern shore of Lake Tahoe. $2,100,000. Cash. Every dollar of it earned by me in courtrooms and conference rooms and on red-eye flights I lost track of around year 4. The house has a name carved into a slate plaque by the front door. The Quiet. I picked it because that's what I bought, really. Not the square footage, not the dock, not the western-facing deck where you can watch the sun drop behind the mountains. The Quiet. After a decade of billable hours and overhead lights and other people's emergencies, I bought myself the right to hear nothing but pine needles and water. My husband, and I'll get to him, believe me, knew exactly what that house meant to me. He sat in the driveway with me on closing day while I cried into the steering wheel of my car. He held my hand. He said, "Baby, you did this. Nobody handed you anything." He meant it then. I think he did anyway. The dinner. It was the last weekend of September. We were hosting a small family weekend. My husband's parents, his older sister and her husband, my husband's younger brother and his wife, and a few cousins who'd flown in from Phoenix. 12 adults, 2 kids. I had spent 3 weeks planning the menu. I'd hired a private chef out of Sal's Lake to help with the Saturday night dinner because I wanted everything to be perfect. My mother-in-law had been hinting for over a year that she'd never been invited up to see the place, which wasn't true. She'd been invited 4 separate times and declined each one because the drive made her car sick or her hairdresser had an opening or some other thing. But this weekend she'd said yes, suddenly, eagerly, and I thought naively that maybe we were turning a corner. The salmon course came out around 8 o'clock. Wine had been flowing. Everyone was loose and laughing. My husband was at the other end of the table holding court the way he always does, telling some story about a sailing trip he took before we met. His mother was on my right. His father, who I actually liked, was 3 seats down talking to my husband's sister about real estate. His mother turned to me. She put her hand on my forearm, the way she does when she wants people to think we're close. She smiled and she said in a voice that carried over the music and the silverware, "So dear, when are you going to do the right thing and let your brother-in-law's new family move in here? It's such a waste, all this space for 2 people. I want to be exact about what happened next because I've replayed it about 1,000 times and I still can't quite believe how the room reacted. Nobody dropped a fork. Nobody gasped. 3 or 4 people laughed. My husband's sister laughed. The cousin sitting across from me, a woman I'd known for 6 years who had stayed in my guest room twice, laughed. Because they all already knew. That was the thing that hit me first. Not the words, the laughter. The casual, comfortable laughter of people who had already had this conversation behind my back multiple times and were now watching the punchline land on my face. I want to tell you that I exploded. I want to tell you that I threw the wine, that I screamed, that I picked up the salmon and flung it at the wall. I didn't. I have spent 14 years of my professional life learning how to keep my face still when someone surprises me in a room full of witnesses. I just smiled and asked her to repeat herself, like I hadn't quite caught it. She did. She repeated it louder. She added details. My brother-in-law, my husband's younger brother, a guy named Brennan who sells industrial real estate and who I had always found pleasant if a little oily, had apparently gotten his assistant pregnant about 6 months ago. His wife, a sweet woman who was sitting 4 seats down from me eating her salmon with no idea what was coming, did not know. Brennan was, according to his mother, in the process of restructuring his life, which meant he was going to leave his wife and move in with the assistant and the new baby, and the family had decided, as a family, that the best place for them to start fresh was here, at the Quiet. My house. His mother explained all of this to me in the same tone you'd use to explain a thoughtful seating chart. She said it would only be temporary, of course, until they got on their feet, and that, of course, my husband and I could keep one of the smaller bedrooms upstairs for our visits, and wasn't it just perfect that the place was so big and so empty most weeks? I looked down the table at my husband. He wouldn't meet my eye. He was suddenly very interested in his wine glass. He was rotating the stem between his thumb and forefinger like there was a watch face on the bottom he was trying to read. He knew, he had known, Brennan's wife, Her name was Kira, and she was a kindergarten teacher, and she had brought me a hand-tied bouquet from her garden when she arrived that afternoon. Kira had set down her fork and was looking around the table with a confused half-smile. The way you do when you can tell something has happened but you can't quite figure out what. I made a decision in that moment. It took maybe 4 seconds. I put my napkin on the table. I stood up. I smiled at my mother-in-law with all my teeth and I said, "What a generous suggestion. Let's discuss it after dessert. I want to give it the attention it deserves." Then I walked out onto the deck. The lake was black glass. There was a moon, but it was thin. I stood at the railing for maybe 90 seconds and I made 3 phone calls. The first was to a colleague at my firm, a woman who specializes in family law, who I knew was awake because she'd texted me earlier complaining about a brief. I told her exactly what had just happened in the dining room. She was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "Honey, you need to do this tonight while you have witnesses." She told me what to do, not what I should do morally. What I should do legally, in this exact order, to protect myself. The second call was to the South Lake Tahoe Police non-emergency line. I explained that I was the sole owner of a property and that I anticipated being asked to sign documents under duress at a dinner party currently in progress. I explained that I had heard credible information about a planned attempt to take possession of my home. I asked if an officer could come out for a welfare check and a documented presence. The dispatcher was wonderful. She said 2 units were available and would be there in about 25 minutes. The third call was to Kira's mother. I had her number because I'd organized a surprise party for Kira's 30th birthday 8 months earlier. I said, "I'm so sorry to call you this late, but something is about to happen and Kira is going to need you. Can you please get in your car right now and start driving?" She lived in Reno, 40 minutes away. She didn't ask a single question. She just said, "I'm leaving now." Then I went back inside and I had dessert. I want to be honest with you. I sat at that table for the next 40 minutes and I ate a slice of pear tart and I made small talk about my husband's sister's renovation in Marin and I laughed at a joke my father-in-law made about pickleball. My mother-in-law kept giving me these little expectant looks across the table like she was waiting for me to start the negotiation she thought she'd opened. I kept smiling. I kept eating. The chef came out and we all clapped for him. I told him the salmon was the best I'd ever had. Brennan, the brother-in-law, was also at this dinner, by the way. He'd been quiet all evening. Now I understood why. He kept shooting these glances at his mother and at his brother, my husband, like he was trying to figure out whether the plan was still on track. At one point he caught my eye and gave me this smile, this brave smile, like he was about to ask me something difficult and was preparing himself. I smiled back. Around 9:15, my mother-in-law cleared her throat and said, "Well, now that we've all enjoyed this lovely meal, I think it would be a wonderful time to talk about the arrangement." She actually said the arrangement. Like we were in a Jane Austen novel. She then produced, and I am not making this up, a manila folder from a tote bag she had stashed under her chair. Inside the folder was a typed document, 6 pages, double-spaced. It was titled Family U.S. Eagerman. It had been prepared, she explained, by a family friend who was an attorney in Sacramento. She handed it across the table to me. She slid it under my dessert plate actually, with this practiced little gesture like a maître d'hôtel at a restaurant. I picked it up. I started reading. I want you to understand what was in this document. It granted exclusive primary residential use of the master suite, the second guest suite, the kitchen, the living room, the deck, the boat slip, and all common areas of my home to my brother-in-law and his domestic partner and any minor children of the union for a period of no less than 36 months, renewable at the discretion of the family. It listed me as the titled owner, but described my role as custodial trustee for family use. It said I would be expected to cover all utilities, maintenance, property taxes, and insurance during the period of family use. It said that any attempt by me to interfere with the family arrangement would be considered a breach of familial trust and could be grounds for a mediation by the family elders. There was a signature line at the bottom. It had been pre-signed by my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my husband's older sister, my brother-in-law, and this is the part that broke something in me. My husband, he had signed it. At some point in the last few weeks, my husband had sat down with a pen and signed a document that gave away the use of my house to his brother and his brother's mistress, and he had not told me. I set the document down. I took a sip of my wine. I looked at my mother-in-law and I said, "I'd like to read this more carefully. Could we move into the living room?" She lit up. She thought she'd won. Everyone got up and moved into the living room. The chef started clearing dishes. My husband's sister was already opening another bottle of wine. Brennan was on his phone, smiling at something. His wife, Kira, was looking at me. Just looking at me. I think she'd started to figure something out. That's when the doorbell rang. I want you to picture this. I want you to picture my mother-in-law standing in the middle of my living room with a pen in her hand, mid-sentence about how I should really sign at the top first and then initial each page, when the doorbell of my house rings at 9:30 on a Saturday night in September. She paused. She said, "Are you expecting someone, dear?" I smiled. I said, "Actually, yes." I went to the door. The two officers were exactly the right kind of officers for this. One was a woman in her late 40s with a calm, matter-of-fact face. The other was a younger man who looked like he'd seen approximately one weird domestic situation per week for his entire career. They introduced themselves quietly at the door. I invited them in. The living room went silent so fast you could hear the ice settling in the bucket on the coffee table. The female officer, she had a kind voice, looked around the room and said, "Good evening, folks. We just wanted to come out and check in. We had a call from the homeowner regarding some concerns about a real estate arrangement." My mother-in-law, to her credit, recovered quickly. She drew herself up and said, "Officer, this is a family matter. There's no need for police involvement. We're simply having a discussion." The officer nodded. She said, "I understand, ma'am. We're not here to interfere with any family discussions. We're just here at the homeowner's request to make sure everyone's safe and to document the situation." She turned to me. She said, "Ma'am, are you the legal owner of this property?" I said yes. She said, "And are these guests here at your invitation?" I said they were. "As of about 10 minutes ago, they are not." She nodded again. She said, "Okay. Would you like to ask your guests to leave?" I looked around the room. My father-in-law had gone very pale. My husband's sister was holding her wine glass with both hands, like she was afraid she'd drop it. Brennan was frozen. My husband was staring at me with this look on his face like he was watching a building collapse in slow motion and couldn't decide whether to run. My mother-in-law was the only one still operating. She actually stepped forward and said to the officer, "Officer, I should explain. There's been a misunderstanding. My daughter-in-law has had quite a bit of wine and she's not thinking clearly. We're in the middle of a family negotiation about—" I held up a finger. Just one finger. I'd learned this in depositions. It works on opposing counsel and it worked on her. I said, "I have not had any wine since 6 o'clock. There's a private chef in my kitchen who can confirm that. Please don't speak about my mental state again." I turned to the officer. I said, "Yes, I would like all of these people to leave my home tonight, except for my sister-in-law Kira, who is welcome to stay as long as she needs." Kira made a small sound, like a hiccup. She put her hand over her mouth. The officer said, "Folks, you've heard the homeowner. I'd like everyone to please gather your things and head out. If anyone needs help arranging transportation or accommodations, my partner can assist with that." My mother-in-law tried one more time. She said, "This is absurd. My son lives here." "My son is on the deed," I said. Very quietly, "He is not. I had bought the house before we were married. California is a community property state, but separate property remains separate property if you keep it that way, and I had kept it that way with the kind of paperwork discipline that only comes from spending your career watching other people fail to do this. The house was mine, only mine. I had never added him to anything. Not the deed, not the mortgage, which I'd paid off 2 years ago, not the homeowner's insurance, not the property tax statements. He had a key. That was the extent of his legal interest in the quiet. He had told her otherwise. I could see it on her face. He had told them he was on the deed. He had told them he had standing. The officer was still standing there, calmly, patiently. Then a few things happened very quickly. Brennan stood up. He said, "Look, this has all been a misunderstanding. I think we should all just—" His wife Kira stood up too. She said, "Brennan? What is she talking about? New family? What new family?" Brennan said, "Kira, sit down. We'll talk about this in the car." Kira said, "We are not talking about anything in the car. You are going to tell me right now what your mother is talking about." My husband's sister, who had been silent up until this moment, suddenly said, "Kira, sweetie, this isn't the time." And Kira turned on her and said, "You knew?" The look on Kira's face. I will think about it for the rest of my life. It was the same look I had seen on my own face in the mirror about an hour earlier when I'd gone to splash water on my face. It was the look of a woman realizing that everyone in the room she loved had been laughing at her for months. The female officer cleared her throat. She said, "Folks, outside, now please." They started moving. Slowly at first, then faster. My father-in-law put his hand on his wife's elbow and steered her toward the door. He wouldn't look at me. My husband's sister grabbed her purse and her husband's hand and basically ran. Brennan tried to take Kira's arm. She yanked it away and walked behind him without touching him, with this terrible blank expression. My husband was the last one to move. He came over to me. He said, "Lo, can we talk? Just us? Tonight. Please." I said, "No." He said, "Baby, please. I can explain. I said, "You signed it." He didn't have an answer for that. He'd been a litigator's husband for 6 years. He knew what "you signed it" meant. He knew there was no version of this conversation that would end with him sleeping in our bed tonight. He left. Kira's mother arrived about 20 minutes later. Kira was in my kitchen by then, drinking a glass of water with her hands shaking so hard the water was sloshing onto her wrist. Her mother walked in and Kira just folded into her like a kid. They stayed in my guest room that night. I gave them tea. I gave them a phone charger. I told Kira she could stay as long as she needed and that I would help her find a divorce attorney in the morning. She nodded into her mother's shoulder. The officer stayed until everyone was off the property. The female officer, her name was Officer Renteria, and I will remember it forever, paused at my door before she left. She said, very quietly, "Ma'am, that was extremely well handled. A lot of people in your position freeze, you didn't." I said, "I had practice." She gave me a small smile. She said, "Well, lock your doors, call us if anyone tries to come back." Nobody came back. Here's what happened over the next 11 months. My husband filed for what his lawyer creatively called spousal restoration of marital property. His lawyer argued that even though the house was technically separate property, my husband had contributed to it through marital labor and emotional investment. The contribution he could document amounted to having installed a Nest thermostat in 2023. My attorney, who was actually a colleague's wife and one of the best family lawyers in Northern California, had a wonderful time with that filing. We countersued for fraud based on the Family USA agreement, which we entered into evidence as proof that he had attempted to dispose of property he did not own. His lawyer dropped him within 3 weeks. He hired a second lawyer. That one stayed but didn't do much. Our divorce was finalized in July. The quiet stayed mine. He got the apartment in the city, which I'd also bought, but which was small enough that I didn't fight for it. He got our wine collection, which I let him have because I'm not a monster. He got, by my calculation, about $85,000 and the contents of a storage unit. I got my house, my career, my retirement accounts, and my last name back. My mother-in-law wrote me a letter in November. It was 4 pages long. It was an apology in the technical sense that the word sorry appeared in it twice, but it was mostly an explanation of why I had misunderstood her intentions and a request that I consider the impact on the wider family of my decision to involve law enforcement in a private matter. I did not respond. I had her address removed from my mailing list. She tried to call my office once. My assistant, a magnificent woman named Teresa who has been with me for 9 years, told her in the kindest possible voice that I was unavailable and would remain so. Brennan's wife Kira filed for divorce in October. I helped her find her attorney. She got the house in Marin, full custody of their daughter, and a settlement that I'm told was substantial. Brennan's career did not survive the divorce. The assistant did not stay with him after the support payments started. Last I heard, he was living in his parents' guest room in Walnut Creek. My father-in-law sent me an email in February. Just one line. "I am ashamed of all of us. I should have stopped it at the table. I'm sorry. I read it twice and then I forwarded it to my attorney in case it was relevant to anything. She said it wasn't, but that I should keep it. I have it printed out in a file. My ex-husband, moved to Denver." I heard this through a mutual friend. He's working at his cousin's commercial real estate firm. He sent me one email about 6 months after the divorce asking if I'd consider lunch. I deleted it without responding. I have not heard from him since. Kira and I are friends now. Real friends. The kind that text each other on Tuesdays for no reason. She brings her daughter up to the quiet for long weekends in the summer. Her daughter calls me auntie. Kira's mother, the woman who got in her car at 9:30 at night and drove 40 minutes without asking a single question. She comes too sometimes. We sit on the deck and watch the lake. Last weekend was the second anniversary of the dinner. I didn't realize it until Kira mentioned it. She said, "Do you know what tonight is?" I said no. She told me. We were sitting on the deck. The lake was that same black glass with that same thin moon. I thought about my mother-in-law sitting in her dining room in Walnut Creek eating dinner with the man who emailed me in February to say he was ashamed. I thought about Brennan in his parents' guest room. I thought about my ex-husband in Denver working for his cousin. I thought about how all of them had sat in this house at my table eating food I had paid for and laughing about how they were going to take this place from me. And then I thought about the quiet, the actual literal quiet, the pine needles and the water. The thing I had bought. Kira asked me if I was okay. I said, I am better than okay. I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. I refilled her wine. She refilled her wine. We watched the lake. It was so quiet you could hear the ice settling in the bucket on the coffee table. I think about that dinner more than I'd like to admit. Not the part where the police arrived, not even the part where my husband wouldn't meet my eye across the table. I think about the 4 seconds before I stood up. The 4 seconds where I had to decide who I was going to be for the rest of my life. What I've come to understand is that none of what happened to me was an accident. My mother-in-law didn't wake up one morning and decide to hand my house to her son's mistress. She'd been building toward that dinner for years in small ways. Little comments about how generous I was. Little jokes about my house being the family vacation spot. Little tests, all of which my husband had quietly passed by saying nothing. Every time I let something slide because I wanted to keep the peace, I was teaching them that the next thing would also slide. That's how it works. That's how it always works. Cause and effect, just slower than people expect. The thing nobody tells you about being kind in a family that doesn't respect you is that your kindness gets recorded as evidence of your weakness. Brennan didn't think he could move into my house because he was delusional. He thought he could move into my house because for 6 years, every single signal I had sent his family had told him he could. The contract on the table that night wasn't the beginning of something. It was the bill, finally arriving for years of me being too polite to say no. So if I've learned one thing from any of this, it's that being good is not the same as being soft. I used to think those were the same word. I thought a decent person was a person who absorbed other people's bad behavior so the room stayed comfortable. I was wrong. Real decency has a spine in it. Real decency knows the difference between a mistake and a pattern and refuses to subsidize the pattern just to keep the peace. The other thing I've learned is that strength is mostly preparation. I didn't beat them in that living room because I was clever or brave in the moment. I beat them because, 10 years earlier, a senior partner at my first firm had told me, "Keep your name on your own things, kid. All of them." And I'd listened. The fight was won in 2019 in a notary's office in Oakland with paperwork nobody saw me sign. By the time my mother-in-law slid that contract under my dessert plate, the outcome was already decided. She just didn't know it yet. If you're sitting somewhere right now and a version of this is happening to you, I want you to hear me. Get your papers in order, quietly, without explaining yourself. Tell one person you trust. And the next time someone laughs at something that hurts you, don't laugh along to keep the room comfortable. Excuse yourself. Make your phone calls. Then come back, sit down, and finish your dessert. The quiet you build by saying no is worth more than any peace you'll ever buy by saying yes.